They laughed when I walked into that boardroom. They laughed harder when I presented my proposal. But they stopped laughing the day I walked back in as their new landlord. My name is Catherine Morgan, and this is the story of how I turned the most humiliating moment of my career into the sweetest revenge I've ever tasted. It all started on a Tuesday morning in March, when I was still just another face in the crowd at Meridian Financial Solutions. The company occupied 3 floors of the prestigious Sterling Tower downtown, and I had been working there for 5 years as a mid-level analyst. 5 years of putting in 60-hour weeks. 5 years of watching less qualified colleagues get promoted over me. 5 years of being the invisible woman who somehow kept the department running while others took the credit. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there. The way my boss, Richard Blackwood, would dismiss my ideas in meetings only to present them as his own the following week. The way the other senior analysts would talk over me, interrupt me, or simply pretend I hadn't spoken at all. The way HR would smile politely at my complaints about the toxic work environment and then file them away in some digital graveyard where good intentions go to die. But I was naive enough to believe that hard work and competence would eventually be rewarded. I was foolish enough to think that the proposal I'd spent 3 months perfecting would finally be my ticket to the recognition I deserved. The proposal was revolutionary, at least by Meridian standards. I had identified a gap in their client retention strategy and developed a comprehensive solution that would not only stop the hemorrhaging of high-value accounts, but actually increase revenue by an estimated 30%. I had the data, the projections, the implementation timeline. Everything they could possibly need to see that this wasn't just another half-baked idea from the bullpen. I requested a meeting with the executive team. Richard tried to discourage me, suggesting that perhaps I should run it by him first. Let him massage it a bit before presenting it to the big boys. But I insisted. This was my work, my breakthrough, and I was going to present it myself. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main conference room on the 20th floor. I arrived 15 minutes early. My presentation materials organized in a leather portfolio that I'd bought specifically for the occasion. I wore my best suit, the navy blue one I'd splurged on during the previous year's holiday sale. I had rehearsed my presentation dozens of times, and I knew every slide, every statistic, every anticipated objection and response. The executive team filed in, one by one. There was CEO Marcus Wellington, a silver-haired man in his 50s who had inherited the company from his father and had been coasting on that legacy ever since. CFO Patricia Donovan, a sharp-eyed woman who could spot a penny out of place from across the room, but somehow never noticed when her male colleagues took credit for their female subordinates' work. COO David Sherman, who had the personality of wet cardboard but possessed an MBA from Harvard, which apparently made him qualified to run operations he didn't understand. Richard slithered in last, giving me a patronizing smile as he took his seat. "Catherine," he said, as if my name was something distasteful he had to get out of his mouth quickly. "I hope you're prepared to make this worth our time." I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and connected my laptop to the projector. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to review my proposal for implementing a dynamic client retention strategy." I clicked to the first slide, which showed Meridian's client retention rates over the past 5 years. The downward trend was unmistakable. As you can see, we've been losing clients at an alarming rate. Our retention rate has dropped from 87% to 71%, which translates to approximately $15 million in lost revenue annually. There were a few nods around the table, but I could sense the skepticism. I pressed on, clicking to the next slide. However, I've identified the root cause of this problem, and I believe I have a solution that will not only stop the bleeding, but actually increase our client base by 25% within the first year. That's when the snickering started. It was subtle at first, just a few exchanged glances and barely suppressed smirks. But as I continued my presentation, outlining the comprehensive strategy I'd developed, the mockery became more obvious. "Catherine," Marcus interrupted when I was halfway through explaining the implementation timeline. "This is all very ambitious. But don't you think you might be overreaching here? I mean, client retention isn't exactly your area of expertise." Actually, sir, I've been working with client accounts for the past 3 years, and I've maintained a 93% retention rate with my portfolio, which is significantly higher than the company average. David Sherman leaned back in his chair and chuckled. Catherine, sweetie, there's a difference between managing a handful of small accounts and developing company-wide strategy. Maybe you should stick to what you know best. The condescension in his voice made my cheeks burn, but I kept my composure. With respect, Mr. Sherman, the accounts I manage generate over $8 million in annual revenue, and the strategy I'm proposing is based on extensive research and analysis of our current client base. Patricia Donovan looked up from her phone, where she'd been checking emails throughout my presentation. How much would this little project of yours cost to implement? I'd anticipated this question. The initial investment would be approximately $200,000, but the projected return on investment is over 300% in the first year alone. The room erupted in laughter, actually erupted. Marcus Wellington threw his head back and laughed so hard I thought he might fall out of his chair. Richard was practically wiping tears from his eyes. Even Patricia, who usually maintained her poker face, was smiling with cruel amusement. $200,000, Marcus wheezed. Catherine, honey, I think you might have miscalculated somewhere. We don't spend that kind of money on experiments. This isn't an experiment, sir. I have 18 months of data supporting these projections. Data from managing small accounts. David reminded me, his voice dripping with disdain. Catherine, I appreciate your enthusiasm. I really do. But you're not seeing the big picture here. This is cute, but it's not realistic. Richard stood up, effectively ending my presentation. I think we've heard enough. Catherine, why don't you head back to your desk? We'll take this under advisement. I stood there for a moment, my carefully prepared presentation only half delivered. My months of work dismissed as cute. The executives were already moving on to other business, checking their phones, having side conversations. I was invisible again. Of course, I said quietly, disconnecting my laptop from the projector. Thank you for your time. As I walked toward the door, I heard Marcus say to Richard, maybe next time screen these things before they get to us. I don't have time for every junior analyst who thinks they've reinvented the wheel. The laughter followed me out of the room and down the hallway. I made it to the elevator before the tears started. And by the time I reached my desk on the 17th floor, I was fighting to keep from sobbing. I sat at my desk for the rest of the afternoon, staring at my computer screen without seeing it. Colleagues walked by, some offering sympathetic glances, others pretending not to notice my obvious distress. The humiliation was overwhelming, but underneath it was something else. A cold, calculating anger that I'd never experienced before. That evening, I went home to my small apartment and did something I'd never done before. I opened a bottle of wine and let myself feel the full weight of my rage. I thought about all the times I'd been overlooked, all the credit I'd lost, all the opportunities that had been handed to less qualified men simply because they fit the image of what a leader should look like. But as I sat there in my living room, wine glass in hand, I remembered something my grandmother used to say: living well is the best revenge. She'd been a tough old bird who'd survived the Great Depression and World War II. And she taught me that sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is to become more successful than they ever imagined possible. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to quit Meridian Financial Solutions. I wasn't going to file another pointless complaint with HR. I was going to do something much more satisfying. I was going to become rich enough to buy them all out. It sounds crazy, I know. A mid-level analyst planning to accumulate enough wealth to acquire a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But I had advantages that my colleagues didn't know about. I had a computer science degree that I'd earned before switching to finance. I'd been teaching myself programming languages in my spare time. And I had an idea for a fintech startup that could revolutionize how small businesses manage their finances. The next morning, I walked into Meridian with a new sense of purpose. I did my job with the same competence as always, but now I was also working on something else. Every spare moment was devoted to developing my business plan, refining my software concept, and researching potential investors. I called my startup Finance Flow. And the concept was elegantly simple. Small businesses struggled with cash flow management, often because they didn't have the sophisticated tools that larger corporations used. My software would provide real-time financial analysis, automated invoicing, and predictive modeling specifically designed for businesses with annual revenues under $50 million. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was developing a solution for the exact type of clients that Meridian had been losing, the ones they considered too small to matter. But I understood something that Marcus Wellington and his executive team didn't. Small businesses were the backbone of the economy, and they were desperately underserved by the financial services industry. I spent 3 months developing the minimum viable product, working nights and weekends in my apartment. I taught myself additional programming languages, studied user interface design, and beta tested the software with a few small business owners I knew. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Finding investors was the next challenge. I knew that traditional venture capital firms would be skeptical of a first-time entrepreneur with no track record. But I also knew that the fintech space was hot. And if I could demonstrate traction with early customers, I might be able to secure seed funding. I started with angel investors, reaching out to successful entrepreneurs who had experience in the financial services industry. My pitch was polished, my demo was compelling, and my market research was thorough. Within 6 weeks, I had secured $200,000 in seed funding from 3 different investors. The timing was perfect. I gave Richard my 2 weeks' notice on a Friday afternoon, citing a career opportunity that I preferred not to discuss. He barely looked up from his computer when I handed him my resignation letter. "That's probably for the best," he said dismissively. "I'm sure you'll find something more suited to your skill level." I smiled sweetly. "I'm sure I will." Launching Finance Flow was like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was a net below. But within the first month, I had 50 paying customers. Within 3 months, I had 200. The word-of-mouth marketing was incredible because the software actually solved real problems for real businesses. My first major break came when a local restaurant chain with 12 locations signed up for the premium version of the software. The owner, Maria Santos, was so impressed with the cash flow improvements that she wrote a detailed review and recommended Finance Flow to her network of small business owners. That review led to a feature article in a regional business magazine, which led to inquiries from businesses across the country. I was working 16-hour days, but I was building something that mattered, something that was mine. By the end of the first year, Finance Flow had over 1,000 customers and was generating $2 million in annual recurring revenue. I hired my first employees, moved into a real office, and started working on version 2 of the software with additional features. The second year was even better. I secured a Series A funding round of $5 million, which allowed me to expand the team and accelerate product development. We added integrations with major accounting software, developed a mobile app, and launched a suite of advanced analytics tools. But the real breakthrough came in year 3 when we partnered with a major payment processor to offer integrated merchant services. This meant that Finance Flow wasn't just helping businesses manage their money, we were actually helping them make money by streamlining their payment processes. Revenue exploded. We went from $2 million to $20 million in annual recurring revenue in just 18 months. The growth was so rapid that I had to hire a CFO to help manage the financial complexity of scaling a high-growth startup. That's when the acquisition offers started coming in. First, it was smaller fintech companies looking to add our customer base to their platforms. Then it was major software companies that wanted to integrate our functionality into their existing business suites. Finally, it was the big banks and financial services companies that had initially ignored the small business market. I turned them all down. Finance Flow was my baby, and I wasn't ready to sell. But more importantly, I had a different plan in mind. By year 4, Finance Flow was valued at over $200 million. We had expanded internationally, opened offices in 5 major cities, and were processing over $1 billion in transactions annually for our customers. I'd gone from being a dismissed analyst to being featured on the cover of Forbes as one of the 30 under 30 entrepreneurs to watch. But I never forgot about Meridian Financial Solutions. I kept tabs on the company through industry publications and my network of former colleagues. The news wasn't good for them. They had continued to lose clients. Their stock price had declined by 30%, and there were rumors of potential layoffs. The final straw came when I learned that they had lost their biggest client, a manufacturing company that had been with them for over 15 years. The client had switched to a smaller, more agile firm that offered better service and more competitive pricing. It was exactly the kind of client that my original proposal had been designed to retain. That's when I decided it was time to make my move. Not on Meridian directly, but on something even more important to them: their headquarters. Sterling Tower was a 40-story glass monument to corporate excess in the heart of the financial district. Meridian occupied floors 18 through 20, with a 10-year lease that still had 6 years remaining. But the building itself was owned by a real estate investment trust that had been struggling with occupancy rates and maintenance costs. I had my lawyers conduct a thorough analysis of the building's ownership structure and financial situation. What they found was fascinating. The REIT was overleveraged. Several major tenants were considering relocating, and the building needed significant capital improvements that the current owners couldn't afford. I made an offer to purchase the building for $95 million, which was below market value but represented a lifeline for the financially distressed REIT. The offer was contingent on a 30-day due diligence period, during which I would have access to all tenant agreements, financial records, and building systems. The due diligence process was revealing. Sterling Tower was indeed in financial trouble, but it was also a prime piece of real estate in an excellent location. With the right improvements and management, it could be highly profitable. More importantly, it would give me control over Meridian's future. I structured the acquisition through a subsidiary of Finance Flow, which meant that very few people knew about my involvement. The purchase closed on a Tuesday in October, exactly 4 years and 7 months after that humiliating meeting in the 20th floor conference room. I spent the next 2 weeks reviewing all the tenant agreements and developing a comprehensive improvement plan for the building. I also had my lawyers send a letter to all tenants announcing the ownership change and outlining the upcoming renovations. Meridian's lease had a clause that allowed for rent increases based on building improvements, which was standard in most commercial leases. I had my property management team schedule a meeting with Marcus Wellington to discuss the upcoming changes. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a tailored black suit that cost more than I used to make in a month. I waited in the lobby until Marcus came down from his office, looking annoyed at having to meet with what he assumed was just another property manager. "Mr. Wellington," I said, extending my hand. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me." He shook my hand distractedly, clearly not recognizing me. "Of course, though I'm not sure why we need to meet in person. Couldn't this have been handled over email?" "I think you'll find that this conversation is better had face-to-face," I replied. "Shall we go up to your office?" We rode the elevator to the 20th floor in silence. Marcus was checking his phone, probably calculating how much this meeting was going to cost him in billable hours. When we reached his office, he gestured for me to sit across from his desk. "So," he said, settling into his leather chair, "what's this about building improvements?" I opened my portfolio and pulled out a comprehensive renovation plan. Sterling Tower is going to undergo significant upgrades over the next 12 months. New HVAC systems, updated electrical infrastructure, lobby renovations, and elevator modernization. The total investment will be approximately $15 million. Marcus glanced at the documents without really reading them. "That's fine. Whatever needs to be done. But I hope you're not expecting us to pay for these improvements." "Actually," I said, "according to Section 4.3 of your lease agreement, building improvements that increase the property value by more than 10% allow for proportional rent increases." Now I had his attention. "What kind of increase are we talking about?" "Based on the scope of the improvements, I estimate that your rent will increase by approximately 40%, effective January 1st. Marcus's face went pale. 40%? That's impossible. We can't afford that kind of increase." I understand that it's a significant adjustment, I said sympathetically. But these improvements are necessary to maintain the building's competitive position in the market. I'm sure a successful company like Meridian can find a way to accommodate the increase. This is ridiculous, Marcus said, standing up from his desk. I'm going to have our lawyers review that lease clause. There's no way it allows for that kind of increase. I smiled calmly. Of course, you're welcome to have your legal team review the agreement. I'm confident they'll find that everything is in order. Marcus was pacing now, his face getting red. Who are you working for? What property management company? I'm not working for a property management company, Mr. Wellington. I'm working for the new owner of Sterling Tower. Well, whoever they are, they're going to hear from our lawyers. This is highway robbery. I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the city. You know, this is a beautiful view. I can see why you chose this office. Look, Miss Morgan, I said, turning back to face him. Catherine Morgan. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. I could see him trying to process what was happening, trying to reconcile the dismissed analyst from 4 years ago with the woman who now controlled his company's future. Catherine Morgan, he repeated slowly. You're the owner of Sterling Tower, I confirmed. As of 2 weeks ago. He sat down heavily in his chair. This is some kind of joke. I can assure you it's not. I'm also the CEO of Finance Flow, the fintech company that's been featured in Forbes, TechCrunch, and the Wall Street Journal. Perhaps you've heard of us? Marcus stared at me for a long moment. You did this on purpose. I did this because it was a sound business investment. Sterling Tower is an excellent property in a prime location. The fact that it allows me to address some unfinished business with Meridian is just a bonus. You can't do this. There are laws about retaliatory eviction. I sat back down and leaned forward slightly. Mr. Wellington, I'm not evicting anyone. I'm simply implementing the terms of your existing lease agreement. The rent increase is based on legitimate building improvements that will benefit all tenants. No one's going to believe this is coincidental. Maybe not. But they'll believe that it's legal, because it is. I stood up and collected my papers. You have 60 days to decide whether you want to accept the new lease terms or exercise your right to terminate the agreement. If you choose to terminate, I'll need 90 days' notice as specified in the lease. Marcus was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. You're destroying jobs, people who work here, people who had nothing to do with whatever grudge you're holding. I'm not holding a grudge, Mr. Wellington. I'm running a business. And speaking of business, I have a proposal that might interest you. I pulled out another document from my portfolio. This is a comprehensive client retention strategy that could help Meridian stop losing accounts and actually grow your revenue by an estimated 30%. The implementation cost would be approximately $200,000, but the return on investment would be substantial. Marcus looked at the document as if it might bite him. This is the same proposal you presented 4 years ago. With some updates and improvements, yes. I've had time to refine it based on real-world experience with my own company. Why are you doing this? I considered the question for a moment. Because I believe in second chances. Mr. Wellington, 4 years ago, you and your executive team dismissed me and my ideas without serious consideration. You laughed at me, called my work cute, and suggested that I wasn't qualified to develop company-wide strategy. Catherine, You were wrong, I continued. Not just about my qualifications, but about the strategy itself. Every principle in that proposal has been proven successful in my own business. I've used these exact methods to build a company that's worth over $200 million. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. What do you want? I want you to implement the strategy. I want you to give it the serious consideration it deserved 4 years ago. And I want you to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, you were wrong to dismiss it. And if we do that, then I'll consider restructuring your lease to make the rent increase more manageable. Perhaps we can phase it in over 2 years instead of implementing it all at once. Marcus looked at the proposal again, actually reading it this time. "This is good work," he admitted grudgingly. "I know it is. I knew it 4 years ago. And I know it now. Catherine, I owe you an apology. The way we treated you in that meeting was unprofessional and wrong." I had imagined this moment countless times over the past 4 years. I had pictured myself being gracious and magnanimous, taking the high road and accepting his apology with dignity. But now that it was actually happening, I found that the anger was still there, still burning just beneath the surface. "Mr. Wellington, I appreciate the apology, but an apology doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase the humiliation I felt or the opportunities I lost because of the toxic culture at this company." "You're right," he said quietly. "It doesn't. However," I continued, "I'm not interested in destroying Meridian. I'm interested in proving a point. This proposal works. It could have saved your company millions of dollars and prevented the client losses you've experienced over the past 4 years." Marcus nodded slowly. "What would you need from us to move forward?" "I need you to present this strategy to your executive team and implement it properly. I need you to acknowledge publicly that it was originally developed by a former employee who was wrongfully dismissed. And I need you to commit to creating a more inclusive and respectful workplace culture. And in return, I'll restructure your lease to phase in the rent increase over 3 years instead of implementing it immediately. I'll also provide consulting services to help with the implementation of the retention strategy." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, reading through the proposal and considering the offer. Finally, he looked up at me. "You could have just destroyed us. You could have forced us out of the building and watched us fail." "I could have," I agreed. "But that wouldn't have proven anything except that I could afford to be vindictive. This way, I get to prove that I was right about the strategy. And Meridian gets a chance to become a better company. Catherine, I have to ask, how did you do it? How did you go from being an analyst here to owning this building?" I smiled. And for the first time in 4 years, it felt genuine. "I took your advice, Mr. Wellington. I stuck to what I knew best. I knew that small businesses were underserved by the financial services industry. So I built a company to serve them. I knew that technology could solve problems that traditional firms couldn't. So I developed the software to do it. And I knew that hard work and good ideas would eventually be rewarded, even if it took longer than I expected. And now you're worth more than I ever dreamed of when I was sitting at my desk on the 17th floor." Marcus stood up and walked to the window. "I keep thinking about that meeting 4 years ago. If we had just listened to you, if we had taken your proposal seriously, you'd probably still be losing clients and struggling with retention," I finished. "Because implementing good ideas requires more than just recognizing them. It requires leadership, commitment, and a willingness to change. I'm not sure Meridian was ready for that 4 years ago. Are we ready now?" I looked at him standing there by the window, and I could see that he was genuinely considering the question. "I don't know, Mr. Wellington, but I'm willing to find out." We spent the next hour going through the retention strategy in detail. Marcus asked thoughtful questions, took notes, and seemed genuinely engaged with the concepts. It was the conversation we should have had 4 years ago, and I found myself cautiously optimistic about the possibility of working together. By the time I left Meridian that afternoon, we had agreed to a modified lease structure and a consulting arrangement for implementing the retention strategy. I would work with their team for 6 months to help them rebuild their client relationships and improve their service delivery. The next few months were fascinating. Working with Meridian as a consultant was completely different from working there as an employee. Now I had the authority to implement changes, the resources to support my recommendations, and the respect of the executive team. Richard Blackwood had been particularly uncomfortable with the arrangement, especially when he learned that I would be reviewing all client accounts and service protocols. But he couldn't argue with the results. Within 3 months, Meridian had not only stopped losing clients, but had actually won back 2 major accounts that had left the previous year. The transformation wasn't just financial. The company culture began to shift as well. Marcus implemented new policies around inclusive decision-making, employee feedback, and professional development. He hired a new HR director who actually took discrimination complaints seriously. Patricia Donovan, who had been so dismissive during my original presentation, became one of my strongest advocates. She admitted that she had been wrong to dismiss the proposal and worked closely with me to implement the financial tracking systems that made the retention strategy possible. Even David Sherman, who had called my work cute, eventually acknowledged that the strategy was sound. He was less gracious about it than the others, but he followed the implementation guidelines and achieved good results with his operational improvements. The local business press picked up on Meridian's turnaround story, and several publications ran features about the company's innovative approach to client retention. None of them mentioned the connection to finance flow or my personal history with the company, which was exactly how I wanted it. But the real satisfaction came from the results. By the end of the 6-month consulting period, Meridian's client retention rate had improved from 71% to 85%. Their revenue had increased by 28%, and their stock price had recovered all of its previous losses. The lease restructuring worked out well for both parties. Meridian was able to afford the phased rent increases, and Sterling Tower became a more profitable property with the building improvements and higher occupancy rates. As for me, I had proven everything I needed to prove. The strategy worked. The dismissed analyst had become a successful entrepreneur. The woman who had been laughed out of the boardroom now owned the building where it had happened. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about becoming so successful that their opinions no longer matter. It's about proving that you were right, not because you need their validation, but because you know your own worth. On my last day as a consultant at Meridian, Marcus invited me to lunch at the executive dining room on the 20th floor. It was the same room where I had eaten alone so many times as an employee, watching the senior staff at their reserved tables and wondering if I would ever be included. "Catherine," Marcus said as we sat down at a table by the window, "I want you to know that working with you these past 6 months has been one of the best decisions I've made as CEO. Thank you, Mr. Wellington. I've enjoyed the challenge of implementing the strategy on this scale. I keep thinking about what might have been different if we had handled things properly 4 years ago. If we had listened to you, given you the support you needed. You might have had a very successful senior analyst instead of a very expensive consultant," I said with a smile. "We might have had a COO," he corrected, "or a CFO. Hell, we might have had a CEO." I laughed. "I'm happy with my current position. Thanks." "I'm sure you are. But Catherine, I want you to know that if you ever decide that running your own company is too much work, you'll always have a place here, at whatever level you want." It was a generous offer, and I could tell that he meant it, but I also knew that I would never take it. I had built something of my own, something that reflected my values and my vision. I had a team of people who respected my leadership and a company that was making a real difference in the world. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Wellington, but I think I'll stick with what I know best." He smiled at that. "Fair enough. But promise me you'll stay in touch. Meridian could use more people like you in the industry." "I promise." After lunch, I walked through the building one last time, from the 20th floor down to the lobby. It was strange to think that I owned all of this now, that the building that had once represented everything I couldn't achieve was now just another asset in my portfolio. I stopped at the 17th floor, where my old cubicle had been. A young woman was sitting there now, working intently on her computer. She looked up as I passed, and I saw something familiar in her eyes. The same determination I had felt, the same hunger for recognition and advancement. "Excuse me," I said, stopping at her desk. "I'm Catherine Morgan. I used to work here." She looked confused for a moment, then recognition dawned. "Oh, you're the consultant who's been working with Mr. Wellington. I'm Jennifer Adams. I'm an analyst in the Client Services Department." "Nice to meet you. Jennifer, how do you like working here?" "It's good," she said, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I mean, it's a great company. I'm learning a lot." I smiled, hearing the same diplomatic non-answers I used to give. Jennifer, can I give you some advice? Of course. Don't be afraid to speak up. Don't let anyone dismiss your ideas without serious consideration. And if they do dismiss you, don't let it define you. Use it as motivation to prove them wrong. She nodded, though I could tell she didn't fully understand what I was talking about. That was okay. She would understand someday, when she was ready. And Jennifer? If you ever have an idea that you think could really make a difference, don't be afraid to present it. The worst they can do is say no. Actually, she said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening, I do have an idea about improving our customer service response times, but I'm not sure how to present it. I thought about that meeting 4 years ago, about how differently things might have gone if I had been better prepared, if I had approached it differently. Would you like some help with that? Her face lit up. Really? You'd do that? I'd be happy to. Here's my card. Email me your proposal, and we can set up a time to go through it together. As I walked out of Sterling Tower that afternoon, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. The revenge was complete, but it wasn't the destruction I had once imagined. It was something better, transformation. Meridian was a better company now. Marcus Wellington was a better leader. The employees had better opportunities and better treatment, and I had proven that success is the best revenge of all. But more than that, I had learned that revenge isn't really about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about becoming the person you were always meant to be, despite the obstacles they put in your way. 3 years later, Finance Flow was acquired by a major financial services company for $450 million. I stayed on as CEO of the division and continued to grow the business. Sterling Tower remained a profitable investment, and Meridian remained a successful tenant. I still think about that meeting sometimes, about the laughter and the dismissal and the humiliation. But now it doesn't make me angry. It makes me grateful, because without that moment of crisis, I might never have found the courage to build something of my own. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone tell you that you're not good enough, because then you get to prove them wrong. And there's no sweeter satisfaction than that. The woman who was mocked in that meeting bought their $100 million office building. But more importantly, she built a company, changed an industry, and proved that the best revenge is living well. My name is Catherine Morgan, and this is my story.